Are there only two options? Is it either conforming to an ancient tradition or coming up with something completely new on our own? Do we have to choose between giving in to 2,000 years of darkness and bafflement and hunger and trying to figure out what we think about eternity when we can spare the time? In terms of the former, I grew up in a country with no separation of church and state, largely thanks to King Henry VIII. He's more famous for having been married 6 times, or for maybe writing Greensleeves, or perhaps for throwing half-eaten chicken legs over his shoulder. But it was in order to divorce his first wife that Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church and convinced the English Parliament to declare him supreme head of the Church of England. Some 450 years later, I was going to schools that were at least nominally Anglican and included classes on religious education, just like classes on French and geography. At first, RE was reading Bible stories and drawing pictures about them. Growing older, RE lost a lot of its appeal when we no longer got to draw pictures. What's more, it's hard to take ancient stories that seriously when at 10 o'clock they're set in Judea and we're told they're true, and at 11 o'clock they're set in Greece and we're told to call them myths. Still, I enjoyed singing, and I was in school choirs, and I liked what is called sacred music, even though I didn't always agree with the words. Otherwise, by the time I went to college, I had no interest in religion at all. Science was much more interesting. First chemistry and then physics. Here were ideas that were not only fascinating, but could actually be tested and confirmed. I wanted to follow in Isaac Newton's footsteps, so I went to Trinity College. This was right when Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time came out, so I didn't yet know that, though brilliant, Newton was, in Hawking's very understated phrasing, not a pleasant man. I suppose I shouldn't be too hard on Henry VIII for making me read the Bible in school, because he also founded Trinity. It's both the second and third oldest college in Cambridge, since Henry took some of the vast amount of money he got from dissolving the monasteries and combined the existing colleges of Michael House and King's Hall. Newton went there, and its many other famous alumni include the poet Lord Byron, who kept a bear in his room because he wasn't allowed a dog. There's a famous scene in Chariots of Fire that was filmed at Trinity, a race around Great Court that's reenacted at the start of every school year by drunken freshmen. Henry himself is commemorated with a statue over the college's great gate, though by student tradition he holds a chair leg rather than a scepter. Maybe this gives you an idea of why so many British comedians have come out of Cambridge. Sometimes it is a silly place. About to graduate with my degree in natural sciences, I came across a notice from the Fulbright Commission about studying abroad. If my attempt to follow Newton had led me to Trinity, well, why not follow Einstein and go to Princeton? So I applied for a scholarship from the Fulbright Commission for graduate school in the US, and I took the GRE and sent off my applications. I didn't get the scholarship, but I was accepted into the physics department at the original College of New Jersey. I soon discovered that Einstein hadn't actually been at Princeton University, but had instead been on the faculty at the Institute for Advanced Study, also in town. Still, as I did my graduate work on quantum physics, I also got to learn something about religion outside of the rather narrow range of my childhood experiences. Out of 18 of us in my year in physics, 6 were Indian, and I started to learn something about Hinduism. I was introduced, for instance, to a way of thinking about quantum mechanics in terms of the 3 main Hindu gods. The physics is all about energy states, which can be created, maintained, and destroyed. And there are some interesting parallels with Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer. Partly as a result of these Indian influences, I became a vegetarian, and sharing a house with 5 other vegetarian students, I discovered environmentalism. I happened to buy a book, Connie Barlow's Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science, that presented something I'd never heard before, thinking about the universe and nature in ways that could be considered religious, but are also in complete agreement with our scientific understanding. Connie's book introduced me to an organization called the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, dedicated to a dynamic and positive relationship between religion and science. For more than 60 years, IRIS has held annual conferences on such topics as the epic of evolution. That's one of the names, another being the great story, given to the scientific story of creation, from the Big Bang to the emergence of life on Earth to the evolution of human beings. It's not covered by the media because it's not as entertaining as wacky creationists and frothing atheists going at one another's throats. But this is actually an area where people at the interface of science and religion have been doing good work. I moved to Connecticut in early 2001 for a postdoctoral research position at the university there. By then, I'd moved into biophysics, building microscopes that used high-precision lasers to image cellular processes. As it happened, I lived a few blocks down the road from Hartford Seminary, and I heard, through some people that I'd met at IRIS conferences, about a forum they were holding that fall concerning the intersection of spirituality and environmentalism. So I went, and then signed up for my first seminary course on environmental ethics. Of course, the forum was overshadowed by the events of 9/11, which had caused me to question everything that I was doing with my life. I did enjoy my work, building microscopes and trusting that what I discovered might one day lead to useful diagnostic tools or even treatments for disease. And I always agreed with both Ben Franklin and Michael Faraday on the importance of basic research. When challenged as to the usefulness of something he'd discovered, Franklin would respond by asking, well, what is the use of an infant? Faraday's answer in turn was, endeavor to make it useful. But I realized that I felt a need to endeavor to make myself more useful. I didn't know exactly what that meant at the time, but it started with that first course at Hartford Seminary. So something that has occupied a lot of my time, from my first interest in science at the age of 7 and all through the last 15 years of studying theology and practicing ministry, is knowledge. If you want to know the truth, after all, then you need to be able to figure out whether something we think we know is true or not. How, in fact, do we know what we know? During the history of Western European culture, there have been 3 broad phases of answering that question. The pre-modern, where truth is known through revelation, directly or more usually via someone claiming unique authority. That's the usual view of religion. The modern, where truth can be determined empirically and by the use of reason, that's the usual view of science. And the postmodern, where truth is a social construction. Ideas about how we know what we know fall into the field of epistemology, which is an important component of both theology and science. You'll rarely hear the word in science because the experimental method is so well established and seems to work so well that we rarely have to go back and revisit the theory behind empiricism. In religion, though, it's really important to know how we know what we know, whether we're talking about revelation or scripture or tradition or the limits of our human senses. What's more, postmodernism presents something of a challenge to science, but not in the way that you might think. There's certainly a lot of pseudo-scientific rubbish out there, as shown by physicist Alan Sokal in getting published as a complete hoax, a paper called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And if that sounds like gibberish, don't worry, it was fully intended to be. You can even make your own gibberish thanks to websites with mock postmodernist sentence generators that string together long words that sound quite impressive but don't actually mean anything. My introduction to epistemology, by the way, came during graduate school, where my mathematician roommate salvaged a page of someone's thesis on the epistemology of King Lear from the reams of paper that he was dumping in the recycling bin. My roommate sat down with a dictionary and spent a couple of hours translating that thesis page into ordinary English. The result, Shakespeare uses a lot of descriptions. Science uses a modernist epistemology and is right to be skeptical of the excesses of postmodernism, but it still has something to learn from it, just as it finds its roots in pre-modernism. For instance, there's Occam's razor, attributed to the 14th century English logician, theologian, and Franciscan friar William of Ockham. Translated from the Latin, Occam declared that plurality must never be posited without necessity. In today's vernacular, we might say, don't make things more complicated than they need to be. Nobody wants a needlessly bloated worldview, and in fact, Occam wasn't the first to make that case. Earlier philosophers such as Maimonides, Thomas Aquinas, and even Aristotle had some ideas along those lines. All things being otherwise equal, it's best to go with the simplest explanation. It's not really a logical principle. It's certainly not a scientific result. But it is a tool that helps us figure out how we know what we know. It's fair to ask, of course, why we care about what we know and how we know it. Well, here's one answer. What we think we know impacts, overlaps, and interacts with things like ethics and economics. In science, for instance, the process of applying for a research grant and then following through on the proposed research lies at the very heart of the intersection of truth, morals, and money. Then there's the matter of formal education, which we claim we value most highly in this society, but about which there are quite a number of myths. For instance, there's the myth that truth is some objective thing out there somewhere. It's often capitalized to emphasize its hallowed existence. So it takes an expert to try to obtain some of that truth, but it's a strictly one-way relationship, with knowledge flowing from truth to expert. Similarly, there are others who can learn from the expert, but that also is a one-way process, with the expert having nothing to learn during that. There are clearly parallels here with religious models of knowing, where it is only a priest who is allowed to approach the divine, and that's why the word vicar is used, since it means representative, deputy, or substitute. Still, I'm sure we've all experienced this version of education in non-religious settings at some time or another too. A better model is proposed by Quaker author Parker Palmer as follows. Truth is a subject with which those who wish to know may interact, just as they are interacting with one another. This, to me, actually makes more sense in terms of how science works. A human endeavor where researchers test their theories against the world itself, while also being part of a community that works towards consensus on the best way to explain what we experience. Scientific knowledge, then, is not a social construct in the postmodernist sense, but it is a subject with which we interact. As Palmer puts it, as far as I can tell, the only objective knowledge we possess is the knowledge that comes from a community of people looking at a subject and debating their observations within a consensual framework of procedural rules. And he continues, I know of no field, from science to religion, where what we regard as objective knowledge did not emerge from long and complex communal discourse that continues to this day. No field where the facts of the matter were delivered fully formed from on high. Then, of course, there are other ways of knowing. Some, I would argue, of more limited utility but much greater social impact. There is, for instance, the word that American comedian Stephen Colbert introduced to us, truthiness, a quality of something that a person claims to know intuitively from the gut, or because it feels right, without regard to evidence, logic, reason, or facts. As Colbert put it, it applies not to those who think with their heads, but to those who know with their hearts. Referring to the statement that everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they are not entitled to their own facts, Colbert explains that, at least in a large segment of today's politics, that's not the case anymore. Facts matter not at all. Perception is everything. It's certainty. Truthiness is what I say is right, and nothing anyone else says could possibly be true. It's not only that I feel it to be true, but that I feel it to be true. There's not only an emotional quality, Colbert observes, but there's a selfish quality. Of course, there's a big difference between truth, as determined by the sort of communal process that Parker Palmer advocates, and believability, based on what appeals to us as individuals. Responding to that Colbert Report segment on truthiness, process theologian Catherine Keller writes, "In the media matrix in which the real news is the comedy show news about how serious news shows actually are fake news shows pretending to be real, the mirror game of believability keeps us all dizzy." Perhaps that explains how so many politicians can get so far by appealing to greed and fear, with bonus points apparently for being a phony narcissistic impersonation of Cheese Whiz. So how do we distinguish truth from truthiness? How do we figure out what's true from what's merely believable? In the final paragraph of his original edition of On the Origin of Species, for example, Darwin wrote this sentence: "Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows." Darwin certainly expressed discomfort and even revulsion at some of the mechanisms used by evolution to ensure the survival and development of species. Almost all scientists today recognize that such evolutionary principles are a sufficient explanation of life on Earth, acceptable on an intellectual level, even if some parts may offend our human sense of compassion. Our biggest challenge today, particularly when it comes to explaining scientific ideas to the public, is to distinguish between that which is likely to be true, according to the scientific processes of discovery, and that which is likable, based on our sense of, for want of a better word, truthiness. Science is supposed to reach conclusions about the functioning of the world, conclusions that are likely to be true. However, people may have emotional reactions to those conclusions, making them likable or not. Richard Dawkins, biologist, expert science communicator, and opposed to religion in any form, refers to the confusion of likability for likelihood as committing the logical fallacy of argumentum ad consequentiam, appealing to the consequences of an idea, such as how it makes us feel, rather than addressing the truth of the idea. So let's return to Darwin's closing paragraph. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Grandeur is defined as that state or quality of being grand, vastness, greatness, splendor, magnificence, stateliness, sublimity. Certainly there is plenty to amaze us in the scientific story of creation, but there is also plenty to beware interpreting in anthropocentric terms. Is evolution human or human-friendly? Does it need to be? Does it have to be something we like? Or can we be amazed to be a part of it, even if there are things we don't understand and may never understand, much less find to our liking? Can we allow the mystery and the wonder to be bigger than we are? One exposition of the grandeur of the scientific view of the universe is to be found in Ursula Goodenough's The Sacred Depths of Nature. She is a professor of cell biology at Washington University in St. Louis and is a past president of the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science. Her book proposes what she calls a planetary ethic, based on both science and theology, celebrating mysteries that are central to both, such as why there is anything rather than nothing. As one reviewer writes, exploring scientifically based narratives about the creation of the universe and the origins of life, Goodenought forges a kind of religious naturalism that will not be unfamiliar to readers of New Age literature, save that her naturalism has the hard-nosed rigour of a laboratory-trained scholar behind it. Faith and reason, in her view, are not mutually exclusive, the reviewer concludes, and her well-written treatise makes a good argument for bridging the gap between the two. Not everyone was happy with Goodenough's book. Richard Dawkins, for one, wrote a review entitled Snake Oil and Holy Water. He writes, by the book's own account, Goodenought does not believe in any sort of supreme being, does not believe in any sort of life after death. By any normal understanding of the English language, she is no more religious than I am. She shares with other atheistic scientists a feeling of awe at the majesty of the universe and the intricate complexity of life. So Dawkins continues, indeed, the jacket copy for her book, the message that science does not point to an existence that is bleak, devoid of meaning, and pointless, but on the contrary can be a wellspring of solace and hope, would have been equally suitable for my book, Unweaving the Rainbow, or Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot. And he concludes, if that is religion, then I am a deeply religious man. But it isn't, and I'm not. As far as I can tell, my atheistic views are identical to Goodenough's religious ones. One of us is misusing the English language, and I don't think it's me. Actually, I think Dawkins is committing his own fallacy of argumentum ad consequentiam here. He's basically saying, she's describing one way of being religious, and it includes me, but I don't want to think of myself as being religious, therefore she's wrong. Dawkins is succumbing to truthiness himself. And by Dawkins' criteria for religion, requiring a supreme being and life after death, he dismisses some forms of Taoism and Buddhism as religions, not to mention, of course, a good segment of Unitarian Universalism. Science and religion are not necessarily opposed to one another. There was scholasticism, the theological movement of which William of Ockham was part, and in which the sciences were united with theology. There's paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould's views on the non-overlapping magisteria, teaching authorities of science and religion. And then there's this passage from none other than John Calvin, certainly not somebody known for cracking jokes. When a certain shameless fellow mockingly asked a pious old man what God had done before the creation of the world, the latter aptly countered that God had been building hell for the curious. On the other hand, Calvin did say some positive things about science. If we regard the Spirit of God as the sole fountain of truth, we shall neither reject the truth itself nor despise it wherever it shall appear, unless we wish to dishonour the Spirit of God. If the Lord has willed that we be helped In physics, dialectic, mathematics, and other like disciplines, let us use this assistance. For if we neglect God's gift freely offered in these arts, Calvin asserted, we ought to suffer just punishment for our sloth. In other words, he argued that it would be nothing but laziness and also an insult to God to ignore the benefits of science and other sources of knowledge. In Unitarian Universalism, our first source is put into words as direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. There are 5 more sources, which we'll come to later this month, but I like that it's direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder that comes first. After all, it's our own senses and awareness that set the stage for not only spirituality, but religion too. We don't need to buy into 2,000 years of darkness and bafflement and hunger unless that's really what makes sense of our own lived experiences. But just as the scientific method of observation and hypothesis and testing is only a systematic way of trying to understand experience, so too does spirituality demand so much more than an occasional casual thought about eternity. Seeing God in a beautiful sunset really isn't hard. It's a start, but the real test is finding divinity in brokenness and sickness, in the face of the person that you really don't like, in the news that you really don't want to hear. It's the mystery and wonder that goes beyond our comprehension, the renewal of the spirit not by mere aesthetics, but out of desperate necessity, a recognition that life arises from the natural forces of creation, preservation, and destruction. This is grandeur to which both science and religion aspire. Let's explore those worlds of soaring possibilities. So may it be.